And Merry Christmas, YouTube. G3 Iron here, and today we are talking about boss RNG and supposedly the most underrated aspect of the league. So this is a discussion thread that was started by insert stand name here, and we're going to chat about this today, and feel free to leave a comment down below on whether or not you like bosses gated behind RNG, or whether or not you like bosses like the Syndicate Mastermind that you can build towards and actually experience. We're going to talk a little bit about some of the benefits, the pros and the cons of RNG gating content versus actually having attainable, buildable, scalable content. So this is what insert stand name here said. A big thank you to GGG for not locking this league's boss behind Extreme RNG. This is the first time that I actually put effort on getting to the boss rather than buying it from someone, which that's a great point. So first off, that's great. It's great that people are experiencing the league content and getting to see what bosses are actually like, because there's a lot of designed encounters that go on in PoE that really only a small fraction of people actually get to interact with, let alone actually defeat. Which, from a design standpoint, is really cool to have these unique endgame awesome experiences. I remember reading several years ago while I was still working as a consultant doing some research on a particular project in game design. And there was a discussion about how much repeated content gets used when designing AAA titles. And one of the things that a particular designer that was working on the Batman Arkham series had said was that it's really tough to design endgame bosses, and a lot of the time endgame bosses kind of feel bad to play against. They feel like a lot of repetition for things that you've already experienced throughout the game, because by the time designers as well as design teams get around to designing the end game or the final boss, the reality is that most players don't reach that end game. Something that about 80% was the number that was thrown around in this one particular article, was that 80% of players aren't going to interact with your endgame stuff. And now this, of course, was from a AAA title design mindset of a single solo player experience, but that translates into something like PoE when we're seeing that Grinding Gear Games designs endgame encounters a lot of the time around very few players. Now, there's a lot of depth when you think about it, the amount of depth and new content that goes into endgame bosses that most people see interacting through YouTube or through Twitch rather than actually getting to play the game, because for a lot of people it's really, really tough to actually interact and engage with endgame bosses. And throughout this thread there's a lot of people talking about delve bosses as well as even incursion bosses, that if you basically built your temple in incursion in such a way that it was too difficult for your character to beat, then you would, sure, you'd open up the Temple of Atsuatl, but you'd never actually full clear it because maybe it was too difficult for your build. Or vice versa, in Delve, maybe you would delve for hundreds of depths, but you'd never bump into somebody like All. Or in Abyss League, maybe you would run tons and tons of content, but you would rarely see a lich or the particular type of lich that you were looking for in order to farm specific items or complete certain challenges. So in those sorts of leagues, we see two different design philosophies, and we see that here with the Syndicate as well, that there is RNG gated content that's gated simply between random chance encounters, whether or not you will or will not ever encounter endgame bosses, right? Versus buildable or attainable bosses that you can simply progress towards, right? So like some examples of this are in incursion. And with the Temple of Atsuatl, you're always able to build towards a boss. Every time you're encountering Elva, you know that you're building towards that temple where eventually, if you choose to, and if your build can handle it, you will get to fight the Omnitech. So that is a stable style of tiered progressible boss endgame content that you'll be able to eventually clear if your build can handle it and if you can, of course, desire to play it, versus something like All or a Lich from Abyss, where you may never ever get to encounter them, especially if you're playing solo self-found or you're not involved in a trade league, where you're able to go and interact with somebody else that has found the boss, and then you can purchase your way to actually entering the encounter or getting a clear from it. Another type of buildable or attainable boss that's experienced in Path of Exile, of course, is Edziri, which of course you can collect pieces to go and encounter Edziri. Another one is the Labyrinth through Azaro, which plenty of people farm Azaro. So there's good examples in PoE of both RNG gated bosses and styles and content versus progressible, attainable endgame bosses. But what are your thoughts? I came up with just a few. So some of the advantages on RNG gated bosses. One is that you value the encounter. When you actually experience an RNG gated experience, content, boss, level, zone, etc. Bestiary comes to mind with how rare specific creature fights were in order to potentially get the feral drops. Those were incredibly valued. People really valued those experiences. I know a couple of players that specifically booted up their streams or booted up their YouTubes to record those fights that otherwise would not make content, that otherwise would not make regular content, but it was such rare content to experience in Bestiary that people actually just made videos specifically of those fights to go, yeah, I finally found him. The same thing was true in Delve for hitting specific delve depths as well as bumping into specific delve bosses. The same thing happened in Abyss, of course, for specific liches. Also, the second thing that I came up with just as an idea of the benefits of RNG gated bosses is that you can then put a greater value on the drops that they manifest. So for instance, if you're always able to build towards a specific drop, and we see this with like Adziri, for instance, that in the first few days of a league, Adziri item drops, Adziri exclusive item drops are relatively high in their price compared to where they're going to go with the rest of the league. And you can see in a softcore trade league or even in hardcore trade league, those prices plummet throughout the course of the league because more and more players get to access that content. Well, in RNG gated boss or RNG gated content, the value of those things aren't necessarily going to go down because they're still rare no matter what, no matter how long the league is going on. It's still rare to attain those specific drops. So that's a plus for RNG gated content, is that there's a higher value in the drops that they produce. Thirdly, this one is a bit of a meme, and so if you want to meme and laugh about it, you can, but there is a EA trademarked sense of accomplishment that you get when you come across an RNG gated boss. And all of us that play Path of Exile, we are all excited and motivated, some of us more than others, but we're all excited by the blessing of RNGesus, or the blessing of Chris Wilson, as it were, where you get a sense of accomplishment when you get to encounter RNG related stuff. So for some players, that is crafting something that is particularly valuable or particularly rare. For other players, it's finding something that's simply very, very rare to drop, like a Mirror of Calandra or a Headhunter, other League exclusive things. For other players, it's taking down a boss that's an RNG gated boss. There is a great sense of accomplishment that comes with this. Not everybody's motivated in the same way in that regard, but we all do have this sense of accomplishment to some extent. There is a sliding scale of that, some of us more than others, but there is a sense of accomplishment that comes from getting through RNG gated content and bosses. On the other hand, you've got these progressible, buildable, or attainable bosses or content. And there's really three things that I came up with that are benefits behind this. The first is that you get to actually fight them or experience the content, right? So there were a lot of players, and this happens nearly every league, a lot of players that are racing or pushing to maps at the beginning of the league don't care about new league content on their first playthrough because they simply want to get to maps, they simply want to get to their end game and start grinding and making currency. For a lot of other players that want to experience new content right away, you will see players, as soon as they can interact with a league mechanic, interacting with it and trying to push it and trying to play with it and trying to experience it. And so some players for Betrayal League started as soon as you were in the second zone there, leaving Lion Eyes, were already interacting with Jun and trying to interact with the Syndicate and trying to figure it all out. There were players all the way dating back to, at least as far back as I can remember, Essence and as well as even Strongbox League, videos coming out with, hey, this is how you interact with the league on day one, where people were just trying to specifically target and figure out how the mechanic worked and how best to interact with it. So one of the things that's nice about buildable or attainable or progressible content is that you get to actually experience it. So a lot of players dating back to Incursion, as soon as you could interact with Alva, or a lot of players dating back to Delve, as soon as you could interact with the Mines and with Nico, players would simply dive in and jump into that content and make that content the focus of their league experience. So that's the first thing, is you actually get to interact with it. The second thing is that with buildable or attainable bosses, you get to see end game content. So whereas RNG can be very, very rare, attainable, progressible content can be target farmed, and we're seeing that right now with betrayal blocking and with farming specific Syndicate bosses. that you actually get to see endgame content in a way that you want to see that endgame content, which leads me to the third benefit of buildable or progressible attainable endgame content, which is that you can try out multiple builds against a boss. So if I wanted to try out a really memey, stupid, just dumb, off-the-wall build, and then have it go into Delve and fight a bunch of bosses, probably wouldn't work. It'd be gated behind RNG, and I'd have to spend a bunch of time doing it. Whereas something like an Incursion Temple or a Syndicate encounter, I can simply build a build around that and know that I will build my experience up to be able to progress and test my build against that content. So there are benefits and drawbacks to both styles of content, whether it's RNG or whether it's progressive style of content. But anyway, those are some of the thoughts that I had on both of those topics, whether it's buildable, progressible endgame bosses or RNG gated bosses. But what are your thoughts? Leave us a comment down below. Which do you prefer? Do you prefer that moment of exploding excitement when you actually get to experience something RNG related? Or would you prefer something that's a little bit more targetable, a little bit more systematic, like buildable, progressive, attainable bosses? Leave us a comment down below, and Merry Christmas, everybody.